Imagine this. A 17-year-old walks into court wearing a designer power suit that costs more than most people's monthly rent, and within 10 minutes, one sentence will crack her carefully constructed empire wide open. The heavy wooden doors of Providence Municipal Court swung open just after 9 in the morning, and the sound that followed wasn't the nervous shuffle of a typical teenager facing consequences. Before we dive into this incredible case, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing where my viewers are around the world. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss more unbelievable cases like this one. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. It was the confident click of expensive heels against marble, each step deliberate and practiced, the rhythm of someone who had learned to command attention in boardrooms and now brought that same energy into a place where it didn't belong. What started as a simple traffic case would become something far more disturbing, a window into what happens when we give children adult power without adult wisdom, when we celebrate teenage success without asking what that success cost and who paid the price. Madison Blake entered the courtroom like she was walking onto a stage she owned, and in a way she believed she did own every stage she stepped onto. At 17 years old, she carried herself with the kind of calculated confidence that most people don't develop until their 30s, if ever. Her blonde hair was styled in that effortless way that actually required significant effort. Her makeup was camera-ready because everything in her life was camera-ready, and the navy blue suit she wore probably cost more than the monthly car payments of half the people in the gallery. But it wasn't just her appearance that drew attention. It was her energy, the way she moved through space like someone who had never been told no, who had never encountered a door that didn't open for her, who genuinely believed that the normal rules that applied to everyone else simply didn't apply to someone like her. The courtroom gallery was already filling with the usual mixture of people who came to municipal court on a Wednesday morning. Elderly folks who attended regularly like it was their social club, young people hoping to get their own tickets reduced, parents accompanying nervous teenagers who'd made mistakes. But when Madison Blake walked in, conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. Whispers started immediately, that particular kind of recognition that comes from seeing someone you know from screens suddenly appearing in real life. "That's Madison Blake," someone murmured near the back. "The teenager who built that makeup empire. I've seen her on TikTok," another voice added. "My daughter follows her. She's supposed to be some kind of business genius." The words business genius hung in the air with a mixture of admiration and skepticism, because something about a 17-year-old being called a business genius always carried an uncomfortable question that most people didn't want to ask out loud. Madison took her position at the defendant's table with the ease of someone who had been in high-pressure situations before, though usually those situations involved investor pitches and product launches, not judges and potential penalties. Her designer handbag, which probably cost more than the monthly salary of the court clerk, sat on the table like a trophy, and her phone, the lifeline to her empire of followers and content and constant validation, remained in her hand despite the clear courtroom rules about electronic devices. She checked it once, twice, 3 times in the first minute, her thumb scrolling through notifications with the automatic precision of someone who had built their entire identity around being constantly connected, constantly performing, constantly feeding the algorithm that had made her famous. Judge Frank Caprio entered from his chambers with the measured grace of someone who had presided over thousands of cases and had learned to read people in the first 30 seconds. He settled behind the bench, his reading glasses already perched on his nose, and began reviewing the morning's docket with the same careful attention he gave to every case regardless of who stood before him. But when his eyes landed on the file for Madison Blake, something made him pause. It wasn't just the traffic violation, which was serious enough on its own, 45 miles per hour over the speed limit in a school zone, the kind of reckless driving that could turn children into statistics. It was the officer's notes that accompanied the citation, notes that painted a picture of someone who viewed the law not as a boundary but as an inconvenience, someone who had been filming content while driving, who refused to stop recording even when pulled over, who stated to the arresting officer that she was too important to be delayed by something as trivial as a traffic stop. Judge Caprio looked up from the file and studied the teenager standing before him, and what he saw troubled him in a way that went beyond traffic violations. He saw a child who carried herself like a corporate executive, who checked her phone with the entitlement of someone who believed their digital presence mattered more than the courtroom they were standing in, who seemed utterly disconnected from the gravity of why she was here. The bailiff called the case with practiced efficiency, and Madison Blake looked up from her phone not with nervousness or regret, but with the mild irritation of someone whose valuable time was being wasted. Judge Caprio had seen a lot in his decades on the bench, but watching a 17-year-old girl look at him like he was the one inconveniencing her, that was something that made him understand this case was going to be different from the start. "Miss Blake," Judge Caprio began, his voice carrying the gentle but firm tone that had become his signature over decades on the bench. "You understand why you're here today?" Madison looked up from her phone with an expression that suggested she was doing the judge a favor by acknowledging him at all. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied with practiced politeness that somehow managed to sound condescending. "It's about a speeding ticket. I'm happy to pay whatever fine is required and move on. I actually have a business meeting scheduled in 30 minutes, so if we could expedite this, I'd really appreciate it." The courtroom went quiet in that particular way that happens when someone says something so tone-deaf that people need a moment to process whether they actually heard it correctly. She hadn't asked if the hearing could be expedited. She had stated it as though it were a reasonable expectation, as though her business meeting carried more weight than the judicial proceedings she was currently part of. Judge Caprio removed his glasses slowly, a gesture that regular court watchers knew meant his patience was already being tested. "Miss Blake, I'm going to need you to put that phone away. We don't allow electronic devices to be used during hearings." Madison's fingers hesitated over the screen, and for a moment it seemed like she might actually argue, but then she did something worse. She smiled, that practiced influencer smile that had sold thousands of dollars worth of makeup to teenage girls, and said, "I understand, Your Honor, but I'm actually live streaming to my followers right now. They expect daily content from me. This is literally my job. I've built my entire business on consistent engagement with my audience." The words came out smoothly, confidently, like she was explaining something obvious to someone who simply didn't understand how the modern world worked. She genuinely seemed to believe that being an influencer gave her special dispensation to ignore courtroom rules, that her followers' expectations somehow superseded the judge's authority. The bailiff moved forward immediately, hand extended to take the device. Madison's composure cracked for the first time, just slightly, just enough to see the teenager beneath the CEO persona. "Do you know how much revenue I lose every minute I'm not online?" she said, her voice rising with genuine distress. Her priorities were crystallizing before everyone's eyes, and they were deeply troubling. The bailiff took the phone without responding, and Madison watched it disappear like someone watching a limb being amputated. The gallery murmured with a mixture of disbelief and disapproval. An elderly woman in the second row shook her head slowly. A man near the aisle whispered to his wife, "Can you believe this kid?" A mother sitting with her own teenage daughter tightened her grip on the girl's hand, as if proximity to Madison Blake might be contagious. Judge Caprio let the silence settle before continuing. "Miss Blake, let's talk about why you're really here. You were cited for driving 75 miles per hour in a 30-mile-per-hour zone. That's 45 miles over the speed limit. More importantly, this occurred in a school zone during school hours. Do you understand the severity of that?" Madison shifted her weight, and when she spoke, her tone had shifted from apologetic to educational, as though she were about to teach the judge something he didn't know. "Your Honor, I completely understand it looks bad on paper. But I need to provide some context. I was running late for an investor meeting, a really critical one. Time is literally money in my business. Every minute I'm late, I'm losing credibility, I'm losing opportunities, I'm losing revenue. I made a calculated decision based on risk versus reward. The fine for speeding, even if I got caught, would be negligible compared to the potential loss of missing that meeting." The courtroom reacted like she just admitted to something far worse than speeding, which in a way she had. She just confessed that breaking the law was a business decision, that she'd weighed the potential consequences and decided they were worth it. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly. "You calculated the risk," he said quietly. "Did your calculation include the risk of hitting a child crossing the street?" The question hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Madison's face flickered with something, recognition perhaps that the optics of her answer were bad, and she tried to recover. "Obviously I would never hit anyone, Your Honor. I'm actually an excellent driver. I've been driving since I was 15 with a learner's permit. I have excellent reflexes and I was completely in control of my vehicle. The children were nowhere near the street when I drove through. I was monitoring the situation constantly." Judge Caprio pulled out a thicker file and Madison's lawyer, who had been sitting quietly until now, sat up a little straighter. "Miss Blake, this isn't your first speeding ticket. According to this record, you've received 4 citations in the past 6 months. Madison nodded, seemingly unfazed. "Yes, Your Honor, and I paid every single one of them immediately. I'm not trying to avoid responsibility or game the system. I paid the fines, took the points on my license, accepted the consequences. I think that shows I do take this seriously. But here's the thing, and I hope you'll understand what I'm trying to say, I just think the system needs to account for different circumstances. Different people have different situations, different contributions they're making to society, different levels of responsibility. Someone like me, running a business that employs people and creates value and pays taxes, maybe there should be different considerations for how these violations are handled. The words hung in the courtroom like a poisonous fog slowly spreading. Judge Caprio's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. Different considerations, he repeated slowly. Explain what you mean by that, Miss Blake. Madison, perhaps sensing she was on dangerous ground but unable to stop herself, pressed forward with the confidence of someone who had given this speech before and had it received well. I just mean that people who contribute more to society, who create jobs and opportunities, who are actively building something important, maybe they need more flexibility. It's just logical, really. The system should recognize that not everyone's time and contributions are equal. A teenager going to the mall probably should follow every single traffic law to the letter. But someone running a 7-figure business, meeting with investors, managing employees, that person's time has different weight, different value. It's not about being above the law, it's about the law being intelligent enough to recognize nuance. The gallery's murmuring grew louder, no longer the polite whispers of courtroom observers but the rising tide of genuine outrage from people who were watching a 17-year-old girl argue that her success made her special, that her time mattered more than safety, that the rules everyone else followed should somehow bend around her ambition. Judge Caprio let the noise settle naturally, not with his gavel but with the weight of his silence, and when he spoke again his voice carried a different quality, no longer the gentle questioning of a judge trying to understand but the focused attention of someone who had just recognized something deeply troubling. So you believe, Miss Blake, that some people deserve different treatment under the law based on their economic contributions? He posed it as a question, but everyone in the courtroom understood it was really a rope, carefully offered to see if she would hang herself with it. Madison straightened in her chair, perhaps sensing the shift in the room's energy but misinterpreting what it meant, thinking the tension was the natural resistance that came before people understood her point of view. Yes, Your Honor, exactly, she said with renewed confidence, the relief of finally being understood evident in her voice. I'm not saying laws shouldn't exist. I'm saying they need to be applied intelligently. Someone who's creating value, who's employing people, who's building something that matters, they shouldn't be held to exactly the same standard as someone who's just, existing. It's about proportionality. My time genuinely is worth more, mathematically speaking, than the average person's time. That's not arrogance, that's just economics. Every hour I spend not working costs my business money, costs my employees their jobs potentially, costs the economy. So when I make a decision to drive faster to get to a meeting, I'm not being reckless. I'm being strategic. Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, studying her with the kind of intense focus that made everyone in the courtroom lean forward slightly, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Let me make sure I understand your philosophy, Miss Blake. You're saying that successful people should be treated differently by the legal system? Madison nodded eagerly, apparently believing she was winning the argument. Yes, Your Honor. Different circumstances require different approaches. That's just smart policy. The judge's next question came quietly, each word precise as a scalpel. So if someone has built a business, employs people, makes money, you believe the traffic laws that protect children in school zones should be flexible for them? Madison paused, finally sensing the trap but unable to see a way around it that didn't involve backing down from everything she just said, and backing down wasn't something Madison Blake did. Her entire brand was built on confidence, on bold statements, on never apologizing. I believe, she said slowly, choosing her words carefully now but still unable to resist the pull of her own certainty, that successful people have earned certain considerations. We've proven we can make good decisions. We've demonstrated responsibility in other areas of our lives. So yes, I think the system should recognize that. Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably beside her, his hand moving slightly as if to stop her from speaking further, but she was already committed to the path she'd chosen. Judge Caprio's voice remained calm, almost gentle, as he asked the final question. Miss Blake, do you believe that rules, the same rules that apply to everyone else in this city, should apply to you the same way? And Madison Blake, 17 years old, CEO of a supposedly successful cosmetics company, influencer to millions, person who had been told her entire teenage life that she was special and different and destined for greatness, looked directly at Judge Frank Caprio and said 5 words that would destroy everything she'd built. Rules can't apply to me. The silence that followed was absolute. Not the quiet of people waiting to hear more, but the stunned silence of a courtroom full of people who couldn't quite believe what they just heard. Someone in the gallery gasped audibly. The mother with the teenage daughter covered her mouth with her hand. Even the court clerk stopped typing to stare. Madison's lawyer dropped his head into his hands, and in that gesture everyone could see that he knew his client had just confessed to something far worse than a traffic violation. She'd confessed to a worldview, to a philosophy that placed herself above the community she lived in, above the laws that protected everyone, above the basic social contract that held civilization together. Rules can't apply to me. The words hung in the air like a verdict that had already been delivered, and Madison seemed to realize too late what she'd said, how it sounded, how it revealed not just arrogance but something darker. She tried to backtrack immediately, her confidence finally cracking into something that looked like panic. I mean, that came out wrong, Your Honor. What I meant to say is that rules can't apply to me in exactly the same way they apply to people in different situations. Context matters. I'm not saying I'm above the law, I'm saying the law should be smart enough to recognize different contexts. Her voice was rising now, the practiced composure slipping as she tried to stuff the words back in, to unsay what couldn't be unsaid. But everyone in that courtroom had heard the truth in those first 5 words, before she tried to soften them, before she tried to add caveats and qualifications. Rules can't apply to me. That was what she believed, what she'd perhaps always believed, what every decision she'd made up until this moment had been based on. Judge Caprio's expression had shifted from patient questioning to something else entirely, not anger exactly, but a kind of sorrowful disappointment that somehow felt worse. Miss Blake, those are very interesting words. Let's explore what happens when someone truly believes rules don't apply to them. He opened a much thicker file than anyone had expected for a simple traffic case, and Madison's lawyer sat up straighter, alarm finally evident on his face. Your Honor, he began, but the judge raised his hand gently. Mr. Peterson, I think it's time we discussed more than just traffic violations. He looked directly at Madison. Miss Blake, you run a company called Blake Beauty, is that correct? Madison nodded, confused about the change in direction. Yes, Your Honor. I founded it when I was 15. It's a cosmetics line focused on teenage consumers. We've been featured in Teen Vogue, Business Insider, Forbes Under 30. Judge Caprio continued, his voice still calm but carrying a weight that made everyone understand something important was shifting. Tell me about your employees. How many people work for you? Madison seemed relieved by the change of subject, perhaps believing that talking about her business accomplishments would restore her credibility after the disastrous confession she'd just made. I have 12 full-time employees, Your Honor, plus several contractors and interns who work on specific projects. I'm actually really proud of the opportunities I've created for other young people. Most of my team are teenagers or in their early 20s. I wanted to build a company where young people could gain real business experience, not just serve coffee or file papers like traditional internships. Judge Caprio nodded slowly, flipping through pages in the file with deliberate care. And these employees, how much do you pay them? Madison's hesitation was barely noticeable, just a fraction of a second, but in a silent courtroom even the smallest pause carries weight. It varies based on their role and experience level. Some receive product compensation, some get portfolio building opportunities, and some receive monetary stipends. We structure it creatively to maximize value for everyone involved. The judge looked up from the papers, his eyes sharp behind his reading glasses. Stipends. Define that for me, Miss Blake. What does a stipend mean in your company? Madison shifted in her chair, and for the first time her confident posture wavered slightly. It depends on the role, but generally between $50 and $200 per week. Some team members value the experience and exposure more than immediate payment, especially when they're building their resumes and learning skills that will serve them for their entire careers. I always tell my employees that working for Blake Beauty is an investment in their future. The words came out practiced, like something she'd said many times before to justify what she was about to be accused of, but in the context of everything that had come before, they sounded hollow, almost predatory. Judge Caprio set down one document and picked up another, and the courtroom watched with growing tension as the true nature of this hearing began to reveal itself. Miss Blake, I have testimony here from 7 of your former employees. They tell a different story than the one you're presenting. They claim they worked 40 to 60 hours per week for little or no compensation. They were told they were gaining experience in building portfolios, but what they were actually doing was packing orders, managing customer service, creating content, doing all the work that built your business while you collected the revenue. Madison's face went pale, but she tried to maintain her composure. Your Honor, that's a mischaracterization. In startup culture, everyone works hard in the beginning. That's standard. All successful entrepreneurs will tell you the same thing. You have to grind, you have to hustle, you have to be willing to sacrifice for the vision. My employees knew what they were signing up for. The judge's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath now. They were children, Miss Blake. 15, 16, 17 years old. The same age you are now. And according to these statements, when they asked to be paid minimum wage for their labor, you told them they weren't committed to the vision. When they complained about working conditions, you replaced them within days. One girl, Sarah Chin, 16 years old at the time, worked for you for 4 months, 50 hours a week, managing your customer service operation. Do you know how much you paid her? Madison's lawyer finally spoke up. Your Honor, I'm not sure how this relates to the traffic violation my client is here for today. Judge Caprio's response was swift and firm. It relates, Mr. Peterson, to your client's statement that rules can't apply to her. I'm establishing a pattern of behavior that suggests she genuinely believes that. Sit down. The gallery was completely silent now, every person leaning forward, understanding they were witnessing something far more significant than a traffic hearing. Judge Caprio continued. Sarah Chin was paid $75 per week for 50 hours of work. That's $1.50 per hour, Miss Blake. Explain to me how that's legal. Madison's voice was smaller now, the confidence draining with each revelation. We structured it as an internship, Your Honor. She was learning valuable skills. She was getting experience that would help her in her future career. In the startup world, that kind of opportunity is worth more than minimum wage. But the judge wasn't finished. He pulled out another document and another, each one a testament to a pattern of exploitation that Madison had built her empire on. Here's testimony from another employee who asked about overtime pay and was told that successful people don't watch the clock. Here's a statement from a girl who worked through Christmas break while you posted photos from your family vacation in Aspen. Here's a resignation letter from someone who quit because she couldn't afford to keep working for exposure when she had college applications to pay for. Each revelation landed like a blow, and the courtroom watched as Madison Blake's carefully constructed image crumbled piece by piece. But Judge Caprio still wasn't done. He gestured to the bailiff, and a young woman stood up from the gallery, her hands trembling slightly as she made her way to the front of the courtroom. Miss Blake, this is Sarah Chin. She's asked to address the court. Madison's eyes went wide, seeing her former employee in person perhaps for the first time since she'd been fired, and Sarah's presence transformed everything from abstract accusations into concrete human cost. Sarah stood at the witness stand, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady, carrying the weight of someone who had been silenced for too long and had finally found her moment to speak truth. I worked for Blake Beauty for 4 months, she began. I was 16 years old. Madison recruited me from school, told me I'd be learning business skills that would change my life. She made it sound like an incredible opportunity, like I was being chosen for something special. And I believed her because she was only a year older than me, but she seemed so successful, so together, so sure of herself. I thought if I worked hard enough, I could be like her. Sarah's voice caught slightly, but she pushed forward. I worked 50 hours a week. I handled customer complaints, I packed orders, I created social media content. I did everything she asked because I thought I was building towards something. But when I asked about being paid minimum wage, she looked at me like I'd betrayed her. She told me I didn't have the entrepreneur mindset. She said people who watched the clock would never be successful. She made me feel like I was the problem for wanting to be paid for my work. And when I finally quit because my mom was sick and I needed actual money to help with bills, Madison replaced me within 3 days and never spoke to me again. The courtroom was absolutely silent as Sarah finished her testimony, and when she looked directly at Madison, there were tears in her eyes but also something stronger, something like dignity reclaimed. You knew what you were doing, Madison. You knew I needed that money. I told you about my mom's medical bills. You looked me in the eye and told me exposure was more valuable than money. You weren't teaching me business skills. You were exploiting me. And I wasn't the only one. The words hung in the air like an indictment far more powerful than any legal document, and Madison sat frozen, unable to meet Sarah's gaze. The reality of her actions finally reflected back at her in human terms she couldn't rationalize away with startup culture rhetoric or entrepreneurial philosophy. Judge Caprio let Sarah Chen's words settle over the courtroom like dust after an explosion, and in that silence every person present understood they had witnessed something that transcended a simple traffic case. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made even the most routine words sound like pronouncements of fundamental truth. Miss Blake, you came into this courtroom today believing you were special. You believed that your success, your followers, your business accomplishments made you exempt from the rules that govern everyone else. You told me in your own words that rules can't apply to you. And now we've seen what happens when a person truly believes that. We've seen the trail of exploitation and harm left behind when someone decides that their ambition matters more than other people's dignity, their time, their labor, their humanity. Madison sat frozen, her earlier confidence completely shattered, replaced by something that looked like genuine fear as she finally understood the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just about a speeding ticket anymore. This was about everything she'd built, everything she'd become, and the realization that it was all crumbling in real time. Judge Caprio continued with methodical precision. For the traffic violation, driving 45 miles over the speed limit in a school zone, I'm imposing the maximum fine of $1,500. Your license is suspended for 6 months. You will complete 100 hours of community service at a nonprofit organization, and I emphasize nonprofit because you need to learn what it means to work without expecting money or recognition or content for your social media. You need to understand what service actually means. Madison nodded mechanically, perhaps thinking these consequences were harsh but manageable, that she could pay the fine and move on with her life. But Judge Caprio was just beginning. However, he said, and the word hung in the air like a guillotine blade suspended, that traffic violation is the least of your concerns right now. I'm referring this case to the district attorney for investigation into multiple violations of labor law. Your employment practices constitute wage theft, exploitation of minors, and potentially criminal fraud. I'm also recommending investigation into your business finances, because according to these documents, you've raised over $200,000 from community investors while operating a business that loses money every month. That's not entrepreneurship, Miss Blake. That's a scheme. The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispers, and Madison's face went from pale to ashen. Your Honor, please, she began, but he raised his hand. I'm not finished. Blake Beauty will cease all operations immediately pending investigation. All your business accounts will be frozen. Your former employees will be contacted about receiving back wages at the proper minimum wage rate, which by my calculation amounts to approximately $47,000 you owe to children you exploited while building your empire. The word empire came out with such disdain that it felt like a slap, and Madison finally broke. The confident CO dissolved into a 17-year-old girl who had just lost everything, tears streaming down her face as the reality of consequences crashed over her like a wave. That will destroy everything I built, she sobbed. Judge Caprio's response was swift and without sympathy. Good. Because what you built deserved to be destroyed. You built it on the backs of children who trusted you. You built it on lies and exploitation and a philosophy that placed your success above everyone else's well-being. You told me rules can't apply to you. Well, Miss Blake, you're about to learn that they can, and they do. The gallery erupted in applause, not the polite clapping of courtroom observers but the fierce, cathartic applause of people who had watched injustice finally meet accountability. Madison's lawyer tried one last time. Your Honor, my client is 17 years old. Surely there's room for leniency given her age. Judge Caprio's response was measured but firm. Mr. Peterson, your client is old enough to run a business, sign contracts, employ people, and make calculated decisions about breaking traffic laws. She's old enough to be held accountable for her actions. At 17, she's not too young to learn that consequences are real. He turned back to Madison, who was struggling to breathe through her tears. Miss Blake, I don't take pleasure in this. You're a child who was given too much power too soon, who was celebrated for success without anyone asking how that success was achieved or who paid the price for it. Your parents, your investors, the media that featured you, they all failed you by treating you like an adult without giving you the guidance and oversight you needed. But that doesn't excuse what you've done. It doesn't erase the harm you've caused to Sarah Chen and the others who worked for you believing they were part of something good. 6 months from this hearing, the impact of that morning in Judge Caprio's courtroom had rippled far beyond Madison Blake's personal consequences. She had completed her community service at a homeless shelter, working quietly without her phone, without an audience, without the constant validation she'd built her identity around. The criminal investigation into Blake Beauty had revealed even more concerning practices, and she'd ultimately pleaded guilty to multiple labor law violations, receiving probation and a permanent record that would follow her into adulthood. Her social media accounts, once filled with motivational posts about teenage entrepreneurship, had been deleted. The hashtag "rules can't apply to me" had trended for weeks, becoming a cultural shorthand for entitled privilege meeting accountability. But something more important had happened beyond Madison's individual reckoning. Sarah Chin and the other former employees had filed a class action lawsuit that resulted in all of them receiving their owed wages plus damages. Their story had sparked a national conversation about teenage labor exploitation in the influencer economy, leading to new legislation requiring oversight of businesses run by minors. The courtroom footage, despite Madison's attempted livestream, had been shared millions of times, not as entertainment but as a cautionary tale that parents showed their children, that business schools used in ethics courses, that became a cultural touchstone for what happens when we celebrate success without questioning its foundations. Judge Caprio's words, "Rules can apply to everyone including you, especially you," had become a reminder that accountability wasn't negotiable, that age didn't exempt someone from consequences, and that the measure of a person wasn't how high they climbed but whether they lifted others or stood on their backs while climbing. Madison Blake had walked into that courtroom believing she was special, that her success made her exempt, that rules genuinely couldn't apply to someone like her. She learned, in the most devastating way possible, that 17 years old wasn't too young to face consequences, but it also wasn't too late to learn that real success isn't measured in followers or revenue or magazine features. It's measured in integrity, in how you treat people when you have power over them, in whether you build an empire or exploit the vulnerable and call it entrepreneurship. And somewhere in Providence, in courtrooms and communities around the country, that lesson continued to echo long after Madison Blake's designer heels had clicked out of Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom for the last time.